Today's story features both a hero and a villain. The hero is John Adams, a young attorney who 30 years later would become the second president of the United States. And here he is as president. And the villain, you may not expect this, but the man who, despite the fame accorded to him in the 19th century poem, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, many historians have discovered was one of the first intellectual property thieves in American history. But more about Revere later. John Adams was a young attorney and undertook the notoriously unpopular defense of Captain Preston of the British soldiers, who were charged all charged, soldiers and the captain, in the Boston Massacre. Adams courageously took that case in the face of overwhelming and vehement opposition of his fellow Bostonians, his friends, and even his own family. In doing so, however, he epitomized the word professionalism. When an attorney is called upon by his duty and his oath to represent the most unpopular citizens because they deserve representation. And here is how he saw his duty. To what higher object, to what greater character can any mortal aspire than to assist the feeble and friendless, to procure redress of wrongs, to assist and maintain liberty and virtue, and discourage and abolish tyranny and vice. He was considered by many Bostonians to be a traitor to the colonial cause, and by many of his fellow colonists, even by his own cousin, Sam Adams. At the time, he also thought that such an act would probably kill any prospect. He was a very ambitious man of political ambitions. He thought his career would be over. It's a snowy evening in 1770. But the cold belies, and we all know New England winters and the wind and so forth, but that cold belies a boiling Boston cauldron, seething with resentment at King George, rather foppish I must admit, his massive infusion of British troops into the town of Boston. It wasn't called a city until 1822. It was the town, with an E at the end, as a matter of fact, depending on whether you wanted to be fancy or not, I guess. This is a sketch of, the British soldiers who entered onto the scene in Boston, and this is a sketch of the harbor, and it really doesn't do justice to the fact that the harbor was flooded with British ships. You could barely see the harbor itself. Over 4,000 British soldiers were headquartered for duty in the town. And this meant that there were 3 soldiers, think of it, 3 soldiers for every citizen. Just weeks before the Boston Massacre, a schoolboy is shot and killed by a Tory. A Tory, you know, is a loyalist to the king. That is, and then the townspeople, this is several weeks before, were enraged. And radical revolutionary, we'll see him here again. Come on, Sam. Radical revolutionary Sam Adams organizes the funeral, and all hell is about to break loose in Boston. Bostonians bitterly resent the constant British presence for 3 reasons. First, the soldiers are paid a meager wage by the Crown, and as a result, they're forced to look for part-time work. They couldn't even subsist on wages from the Crown. In doing so, they undercut the wages expected by native Bostonians, many of whom were trying to support their own families. Second, the British Navy which needs manpower, often kidnaps men off the street and impresses them onto ships, British ships. British laws allow them to do just that. And third, Bostonians to test the British soldiers who are quartered in their homes. And eventually, as you know from your history books, this leads to the enactment of the Third Amendment to the Bill of Rights in the United States Constitution, which says, no, remember, it was the third. First was speech and church and freedom of assembly. And the second, obviously, was the right to bear arms. And the third was, this shows you how close to the heart it was to the colonists, no soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner. The Bostonians' feelings towards the British are mutual. And here is General Thomas Gage. He has an equally poor opinion of the colonists. He calls them a lawless and a licentious lot in this quotation that we're about to read. The people were lawless and licentious. The troops are here contrary to the wishes of the council, the assembly, the magistrates and people, and seem only to suffer abuse and ruin. Our story this afternoon begins on a Friday. Please remember that, a Friday, March 2nd, 1770, when a British soldier is looking for part-time work. He enters into a rope walk building like this. Now, what is a rope walk building? Well, it's a long, straight, narrow lane or a covered pathway, as you're going to see in the next picture. And this was still up there until the 50s, where long strands of material are laid before being twisted into rope. Rope is essential for sailing ships. The standard length for a British naval ship is 1,000 feet. 1,000 feet of rope. And Boston, as a thriving seaport, has dozens and dozens of rope walks dotting the harbor. See how much rope is there? And here's the HMS Victory. What a beautiful ship, restored. Well, back to the rope walk incident. The owner of the rope walk insults the soldier who's simply looking for work and tells him instead, excuse the language, I didn't say it, well, we then go clean out my shit house, okay? A riot breaks out. Soldier is quickly surrounded and jeered by the rope makers. He returns to his guardhouse just 2 blocks away, where the Boston Massacre will take place just 3 days later, and tells his fellow soldiers what just happened. Now, it is this rope walk incident that sparks the historic confrontation just 3 days later on the following Monday night. Remember, that was a Friday we were talking about. Word of the rope walk confrontation spreads throughout the town, mainly through taverns. Everything happens in taverns in those days, probably still too. Tension builds throughout the weekend. And on the following Monday, by the way, here's a timeline of the events. Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, Boston is seething, and on Monday, we're going to get into that in just a second. It's the evening of Monday, March 5th, 1770. It's chilly, but pleasant, or reasonably pleasant for Boston in March. Chunks of frozen snow and ice are on the sidewalks and the streets of Boston, including what they then called King Street, which we now know to be State Street, okay? After the Revolution, most of the names were changed. And here is the area of the most disturbance. By the way, my law office was right over there on the, not in 1770. In any event, the problems begin in the early evening when, in front of what was then called the townhouse. See, they didn't have it called the State House because they didn't have a state. Remember that? So it was called the townhouse. Apparently, a wig maker's apprentice started heckling a British soldier. This is not uncommon. And it was about a supposedly unpaid bill by the soldier. He yells to the soldier that he had never paid for a wig that his master had made for him. He was an apprentice. Now, in those days, not accusing somebody of not paying a bill was a pretty serious accusation. Unlike today, 28% interest rates and all that. So the apprentice trails the soldier as he returns to the British guardhouse, and he taunts him mercilessly. Another soldier who's on sentry duty hears the commotion and the repeated accusations, as do others, and he says, oh, by the way, this is the entire area. I'll come back to this a little bit. That's the old townhouse, and the King's Custom House is over here on the right. Townhouse incident happens in front of here. Well, the initial incident happens. He's trailing him over here. There's a tavern over here where the soldiers congregate, and there's quarters for the soldiers over here, and then the custom house, which you'll hear about in a little minute, in a few minutes, is over here as well. But that's a pretty good and accurate sketch of what the area looked like. Heated words, the sentry is embarrassed, his hackles go up, and he advances towards the apprentice. Heated words are exchanged, and the sentry strikes the apprentice with the butt of his musket, knocking him to the ground. Now, I must tell you that probably in a parenthetical sense, the truth about that supposed unpaid bill was that the soldier actually had paid the bill. He had paid it to the master directly, but the apprentice wasn't around when he paid it. But it doesn't matter. To be honest with you, that's the sort of misunderstanding that I used to see in the courts every day for 15 years, starting needless fights. A small crowd gathers, attracted by the taunting and the altercation, and they surround the lone sentry and heckle him. Crowd quickly grows to about 50 people. Some young men throw ice at the sentry. He retreats from his sentry box, which is in front of the townhouse, and steps out and loads his gun. He frantically waves his gun, and he goes over to the guardhouse door, and he yells for help. Now, in the meantime, remember, Boston is teeming. It's seething right now. Two other crowds are gathering nearby, and tempers are flaring. Fights are now breaking out across the city. One man exhorts a crowd in Dock Square. Does anybody know where Dock Square is in Boston? It's near Faneuil Hall, what we would consider, what they later called Faneuil Hall. And they march upon the soldiers' headquarters. Another crowd streams down an alley, and someone, by the way, this is the retort that another sentry said, he is a gentleman of his colleague, and if he owes you any money, he'll pay for it. And this is the response from the apprentice: there is no such thing as a gentleman in this regiment. All right, and so the words are exchanged: bloody lobster back, lousy rascal, lobster son of a whatever. And why is that? Because their backs looked like, they were beet red. You couldn't miss them, really. Now, the order is given to turn out the main guard. And that's Crispus Attucks. I'll get to him in a little bit. But this bell, or a bell similar to it, is a fire bell, and it brings dozens more people onto the streets. People don't really know what's going on. They know there's trouble about. They'd love to take a shot at the, not a shot. They'd like to take their frustrations out on the British soldiers. In any event, the guard is commanded by this fellow, Captain Thomas Preston. Captain Thomas Preston, who's the British officer of the day. And confronted with this quickly spiraling chaos, he paces in front of the British guardhouse. He doesn't know what to do. And I'll tell you why. He knows that the soldiers have no right to use arms against the civilians unless authorized by the magistrates. And the magistrates are hardly going to authorize that. And if he does nothing, the situation had spiraled out of control. He believed that the mob would actually kill that sentry. So Captain Preston makes his decision, barks out his order to the soldiers to turn out against the mob. And as you saw that saying, turn out, main guard. 7 soldiers run out, some without having time to even put on their coats. Preston moves the men in columns of 2 across King Street with muskets and fixed bayonets, and they push through the crowd of now 50 to 100 civilians near the custom house, finally reaching the surrounded sentry, who's terrified. Preston orders the sentry to fall back into line with the other soldiers, and he starts marching his men back to the main guard. See, they're retreating. But instead, the crowd surrounds them and blocks them, hemmed in. The soldiers line up in a semicircle facing the crowd, who are hurling chunks of ice, snowballs, and believe it or not, coal and oyster shells. I don't know what you can do with an oyster shell, but there must have been plenty of them there. And Captain Preston orders the crowd to disperse, but of course they're having none of it. And in the meantime, there we go, Crispus Attucks. He is a sailor from one of the commercial ships in the harbor. He was a sailor. And he's in port, obviously, for a couple of days. He steps forward wielding a club. He grabs a soldier's bayonet and he knocks him to the ground. Humiliated, the soldier yells, "Damn you, fire." And in spurts and with no coordination, the soldiers fire 6 leaden balls into the crowd. I'll talk a little more about Crispus Attucks because I don't think people really know the truth, the told story about Attucks. Several soldiers load their weapons and prepare to fire again, but Preston orders them to stop firing. And this is probably, and I've seen a lot of these, this is probably the best reenactment of what happened there.
The investigation into the Boston Massacre begins here on Boston Common. To separate truth from propaganda, we asked actors to reenact the events based on eyewitness statements.
We need this much space to make this line.
Reenactments of eyewitness accounts may show us if the events were physically possible.
You committed the law. You're going to act.
We hope to discover where different sets of testimony agree and where they diverge.
These bayonets are down live steel. You cannot let your attention drift from the bayonet.
The forensic team can focus on the places where the witness statements differ. The shooting involved 8 British enlisted men and 1 officer. The actors portraying the soldiers have reproduced as accurately as possible the uniforms and weapons of the period, including this brown vest musket. As night falls, the actors gather in front of the old State House. The busy city street has been blocked for the reenactment of the Boston Massacre, where it occurred long ago.
To the right the boat, right?
The weather on the night of the reenactment is moderate, but on March 5th, 1770, the temperature was unusually cold, well below freezing, with a blanket of icy snow covering the ground. That evening, a British sentry, Private Hugh White, was guarding the customs house located here. Around 8 p.m., a young apprentice, Edward Garrett, began to taunt White. The taunting continued until White struck Garrett with the butt of his musket. Garrett fell to the ground. Word of the incident swept through the town. A swarm of angry citizens descended on the square. Many of them had been drinking in the local taverns. The crowd surrounded the sentry and threatened him with bodily harm. While the entire town appeared to be erupting, Captain Thomas Preston was in the main barracks across the street from the old State House, close enough to hear Sentry White call for help. Captain Preston marched in with 6 privates and a corporal. The British rescue team reached White and attempted to escort him back to the barracks, but they were stopped by a mob of up to 300 angry citizens. Hemmed in by the crowd, Preston ordered his troops into a semicircle formation and took a position in front of his men. Several people in the crowd dared the soldiers to shoot, yelling fire over and over.
It made the British soldiers feel like they didn't have any courage. You know, they're wanting the fire. They're wanting to answer that call, but they can't. And the crowd knows they can't, so they're daring them.
The demonstration turned lethal when Patriot Richard Holmes struck a soldier, Private Hugh Montgomery, with a stick. Montgomery fell to the ground, then rose up and fired. The Boston Massacre began moments later. The other soldiers let loose a fusillade of musket fire. 11 colonials fell.
Once they fired, the mob retreated. So the soldiers reloaded their weapons, and as the mob had come back in to retrieve their wounded, the soldiers thought that the mob was advancing on them to do them harm. They leveled their muskets at the crowd as if to fire again. When Preston saw this, he immediately knocked up their muzzles, yelling, "Don't fire, stop, don't fire." Preston ordered the men into a column of 2s and then marched them back to the main guard.
Paul Revere, Samuel Adams, and other Patriot leaders quickly claimed that the violent confrontation had been a massacre, a symbol of British tyranny, and they demanded justice. Captain Preston claimed that the shootings had been a tragic accident, but to no avail. On March 13th, Preston and 6 of the 8 enlisted men were indicted for murder. The lawyer defending the British soldiers was John Adams, the same man who would become America's 2nd president. The trial hinged on this question: had the British soldiers acted in self-defense, or did they commit murder?
Immediately claims 4 dead, including Crispus Attucks. The word of the shooting reaches acting Governor Hutchinson, who lives in the North End, which is, as you may know, not very far from there, who rushes to King Street. And he finds an angry mob. There's the governor and a shaken Captain Preston. He speaks with Preston, and then he mounts the balcony of the townhouse, by the way, which was later used to read the Declaration of Independence from, first time publicly in Boston. And he pleads for calm, and he announces, "Let the law have his course," the governor said. "I will live and die by the law." Now, after midnight, the sheriff obtains a warrant for the arrest of Captain Preston. Preston undergoes a preliminary hearing. During the night, they're up all night at this point, and in the morning he is charged with murder. Preston is jailed, where he'll remain until his trial 7 months later. Now, what then happens? There's a rush on for a narrative to create a storyline. The Boston town meeting citizens who govern Boston acts quickly to shape a narrative and influence the outcome of a trial. And newspapers like the Boston Gazette got into the picture. As you'll see, I don't have the storyline from it, but that is a real copy of the newspaper 1 week to the day. Remember, it was March 5th that the incident happened. 1 week from the day, which I'm sure that they covered very extensively at the time. So, within a week after the event, the town meeting appoints a committee to assemble an account and deliver it to key figures in London. Witness statements are taken at Faneuil Hall. I must tell you, having looked at this closely, that there were many more witness statements than there were people who were in the vicinity. It's like when a young lawyer said, "Gee, should I join this law firm?" She was a young lawyer. She had worked for me. I said, "Oh, Brenda, I don't think they have a good reputation. I really wouldn't. Well, I have to pay my rent and so forth." I said, "Brenda, I wouldn't recommend it. You know, you'd be tainted with these people for the rest." One of these, the law firm is one of those ones that advertises on television heavily. And a week later, I got a call from her, and she said, "Oh, you were right. We had an Amtrak accident yesterday, and there were only 96 people on the entire train. But we had 220 come in and fill out witness statements." And I thought, "Oh, God help us. Brenda, you know, whatever." She was a good kid. In any event, so they're taking witness statements at Faneuil Hall. Now, when people hear that the judges have decided to delay the trial of the British soldiers, a town of committee leaders, headed by that troublemaker, is the only word really to describe him. The history books will kindly call him a revolutionary and a patriot and all that, but he was really a troublemaker. He had an irascible personality, as did Adams, by the way, John Adams. He, meaning Sam Adams, and Joseph Warren. Does anybody know where Joseph Warren fits in the story of the American Revolution? Yes.
Was it Breed's Hill?
Yeah, he was killed at Breed's Hill. Yeah, he's one of the few who died there. He was a doctor. In any event, they accompanied a mob and went into the courthouse, well, the townhouse, where the court was conducting the arraignments of all these people, and they disrupted the court proceedings and harangued the justices. And several of the justices refused to conduct business there ever again, and they didn't. And there's Dr. Warren. He was quite a talent, from what I understand, and a very good person. So the defense attorneys, Captain Preston quickly recruits a lawyer, and through intermediaries, he eventually gets John Adams to represent him. And when word gets out, Adams endures withering criticism from the townspeople. His own father is outraged by his son's decision to take the case. But Adams responds that the soldiers deserve counsel and are presumed innocent until proven guilty. I'll tell you what Adams publicly then said, and then I'll tell you what the private story is as well. Here's what Adams later said about his decision. Oh, these are these are his co-counsel. Excuse me. Hosea Quincy was prosecutor. This is what Adams wrote. Counsel ought to be the very last thing that an accused person should want in a free country. The bar ought to be independent and impartial at all times and in every circumstance. The persons whose lives were at stake ought to have the counsel they deserved. This would be as important a cause as ever was tried in a court or country of the world. One of the interesting side notes, if I could digress for a moment, is these patriots. Adams, Franklin, Robert Wilson from Pennsylvania, the signatories to the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson, obviously, all understood that they were playing a role that would resound throughout history. They all knew that. They knew that this was an unusual governing experiment that they were going to engage in. And so when you look at some of the things that they said or wrote, they knew they were writing for people in Bourne, Massachusetts 250 years later. They knew that. In any event, getting back to the trial, Captain Preston doesn't help himself. He writes a long, self-serving, inflammatory account. God help us. Our clients are going to kill us lawyers. If they could just listen to what we say, keep your mouth shut, I'll do the talking for you, and I'll put the best whatever. But clients can be your best friends or your worst enemies. That's the truth of it, folks. In any event, Preston writes an absolutely inflammatory account disparaging the people of Boston and sends it to England. London's newspapers pick it up and they run with it. And a ship then returns from England to Boston with the London newspapers, and the townspeople are even more enraged to read what Preston says about them. So we move on to the trials. He kind of looks like a guy who would write such a letter to me. That nose in the air. At Captain Preston's trial, Adams cleverly narrows the legal issue at trial to that of self-defense and argues the following. By the way, this is a pretty near accurate sketch of how crowded the whole area was. And everybody, by the way, was standing. They didn't have seats for the people. Adams these are his trial notes. Self-preservation is the first law of nature. Now, how can you argue with that? Self-love is the strongest principle in our breasts, and self-preservation not only is our inalienable right, but our clearest duty by the law of nature. The judge instructs the jury on self-defense, and this is what he says. A person is allowed to act in self-defense if evidence of self-defense is present. The Commonwealth must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant did not act in self-defense. In other words, if you have a reasonable doubt whether or not the defendant acted in self-defense, your verdict must be not guilty. Now, a person obviously is allowed to act in self-defense. And that was the main issue that Adams had really narrowly focused the entire trial on. And that's the modern day jury instruction that we use in the courts. They give us a jury instruction binder. It's like 5 volumes. And this is the one that we use today. I've used this many times. And it's basically the argument in the Commonwealth Rex versus Weems, which is the Boston Massacre, the formal name of that case. All right, and so here we're going to see a little excerpt from Paul Giamatti in arguing for his soldiers. Actually, he's arguing just for Captain Preston, because the soldiers' trial followed about 3 weeks later. And here we go.
And for the prisoners of the bar.
In the words of the Marquis of Massacre, if by supporting the rights of mankind, I shall save from the agonies of death one unfortunate victim of tyranny or of ignorance equally fatal, his blessings will be sufficient consolation to me for the contempt of all mankind. When people are taxed without representation, they are sometimes to feel abused. And sometimes they may even rebel. But we must take care, lest, borne away by a torrent of passion, we make shipwreck of conscience. Prisoners must be judged solely upon the evidence produced against them in court and by nothing else. And the evidence we have heard speaks plainly enough, gentlemen. A sentry's post is his castle, and to attack it by English law is an illegal act. Soldiers so assaulted may defend themselves to the death. The people are crying, kill them, knock them down. And they're heaving sharp, cutting ice, oyster shells, clubs. What are they to do? Behave like stoic philosophers lost in apathy? Disregard these uniforms. Consider the men who wear them. Consider yourselves in such a situation and judge if a reasonable man would not fear for his life. Facts are stubborn things. See, whatever our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictums of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. And we see the law, on the one hand, is inexorable to the cries and lamentations of the prisoners, but on the other hand, it is deaf as an adder to the clamors of the populace. Gentlemen of the jury, I submit to your candor and justice the prisoners and their cause.
Adams was just representing Captain Thomas Preston. The soldier's trial occurred a month later, and he wasn't part of that. But in any event, after a 6-day trial, the jury finds Preston not guilty on the grounds of self-defense for murder, not guilty of I think it was either a lesser included. I'm not sure what the second charge was. I've forgotten offhand. And in what was later called the soldier's trial that was followed, you remember Preston was found not guilty. 6 of the soldiers were found not guilty, but 2 were found guilty of manslaughter. All right. Now we'll get to that in a little bit about what their sentence was going to be. So, moving back from a lens of looking at this in a holistic sense, how does history view this dramatic event? Well, the story obviously has echoed through the pages of newspapers, history books, and pamphlets for over 250 years. Let's talk about the Boston Massacre story. The story. The descriptions of the event of that Monday evening are so contradictory that it's difficult to get an accurate sense of what really happened. And there's many reasons for this. First, there was a need by the colonists to control the narrative right from the beginning. Radicals such as Sam Adams wanted to set the narrative to advance their political agenda. And secondly, the British Empire wanted to protect its image and assert its control and its dignity, and assert its control over an increasingly rebellious colony. And its national pride, especially through its Boston Loyalist sympathizers, was at stake. And third, Paul Revere, a clever businessman, wanted to, in part, monetize the event, make money from it, from a tragedy. So let's talk about how the narrative about the Boston Massacre was created, and this will tell you something about how stories are told in court. This event began in confusion. The basic facts are unclear. The participants are trying to make sense of what has just happened. And the next step usually in the storytelling process, is the period of contestation, where competing interests construct alternate narratives, with each highlighting some aspects of the event and suppressing others. And during this process, each side tries out various scenarios and views, and eventually develops a coherent interpretation. You know, as human beings, our minds do not recall everything that we see objectively. And in moments of stress, the mind picks up patches of highly subjective impressions. It is only through a narrative, by subsequently devising a story, organizing those little patches of memory into a meaningful pattern, that a dramatic episode develops into a form that can be remembered, interpreted, and argued. The Boston Massacre case offers an opportunity to observe how flashes of memory gradually developed competing narratives. So, we then proceed to the question. See if I can find it. Okay. Was it a massacre? Anybody want to raise their hands? Do you believe it was a massacre? No one. Okay. Well, in today's use of the term, it means a high body count. But actually, in the 18th century, the term massacre could apply to even one death if it was committed with cruelty and atrocity. So here, Sam Adams, who was an accomplished political strategist, skillfully employed the phrase as political rhetoric. By comparison, the British wanted to establish their own narrative. And let me show you the booklet that they came out with and reproduced in large quantity. Yeah, that's the, you've probably seen this. This was widely spread, obviously by Sam Adams. And this is how the British referred to it. A fair account of the late unhappy disturbance. Only the Brits could come up with something like that, right? Immediately after the event, people on all sides began to spin out explanations that depended on their divergent views of the town and its occupiers. And the townspeople of Boston shaped the narrative to channel their venom on the long-standing complaints they had about the town's occupation by the British soldiers. They viewed this event as the culmination of an unjust encroachment upon their rights. Perhaps the most powerful propaganda weapon in the colonists' arsenal was a simple sketch, and I'll pass this out to you. This sketch, which many of you probably have seen in your history books. It was drawn by Paul Revere and widely distributed throughout the colonies and down through history. And to this day, this is how we remember the Boston Massacre. But that engraving is not without controversy. Revere's image was created to express outrage at the actions of the British troops and solicit support for the Patriot cause. The images of the confrontation between the soldiers and the townspeople is significant and compelling, but they're historically inaccurate. Revere decides to influence public opinion by depicting a line of redcoats. Let's see if I have one of these. We'll get to that. No. Yeah, there it is. All right. By depicting a line of redcoats when, in fact, there was no such organized military action and the soldiers were facing an unruly mob of about 60 people. Paul Revere actually stole that sketch that you've just seen from a Boston painter and engraver with whom he shared office space, a fellow by the name of Henry Putnam. This is Putnam's sketch. They were not business partners. Revere visited the print shop where when Putnam wasn't there, saw this engraving and stole it and put it out as his own. He did change it in about 12 different respects, and if you really need to know the details of what he did, I'm happy to share them with you. Working from Pelham's rendition of the scene, Revere creates, advertises, and issues his own version called The Bloody Massacre, and you can see it down there somewhere. All right, there's Pelham's, and that's Revere. Pelham didn't make a nickel. Revere got rich. Pelham angrily complained in writing to Revere, and there's a side-by-side of them. Revere's is actually better, I think, but it's still. Pelham writes to Revere, when I heard that you was, this is the way they talked, cutting a plate of the late murder, I thought it impossible, as I knew you were not capable of doing it, unless you copied it from mine. And I thought I had entrusted it in the hands of a person who had more regard to the dictates of honor and justice than to take the undue advantage you have done of the confidence and trust I reposed in you. Although there were no laws protecting intellectual property, obviously in 1770, what Revere did was unseemly at first and thievery in the worst sense. And finally, there's one more important person in this drama that we focus on today. The first person who was killed that Monday night in the Boston Massacre and his death in the American Revolution. One of the first deaths was Crispus Attucks. As historians can best determine, even though he was a sailor, he was originally from Framingham. Yeah, he was born in Framingham of mixed parentage, African and Native American descent. Town records describe him as having been a slave of a Deacon William Brown. It's thought that he was a runaway slave and had become a sailor and a whaler working either at sea or around the docks on the eastern Atlantic seaboard. During that fateful evening of March 5th, Attucks was part of a group of men who approached the townhouse armed with clubs. Attucks struck a British soldier with a piece of wood. For it, he took 2 bullets in the chest and died that night. His body was carried to Faneuil Hall, and some people say, well, was he buried with the white people? The answer is, yeah, absolutely he was. His body lay in state for people to mark the occasion for 4 days until he and the other victims were buried together. So, I pressed the question, who won the battle for the narrative? Anybody want to try that one? Paul Revere. Yes, you got Paul Revere.
It's a massacre. We call it a massacre.
Bingo. That's it. Who won the narrative? It's called the Boston Massacre. We don't call it an unhappy disturbance. And if we did, we wouldn't be talking about it. The very fact that we call it the Boston Massacre means that we've all formed a judgment about it, or at least historically. So what are the enduring lessons of the Boston Massacre? First, it's been invoked repeatedly for over 2 centuries to describe when government misuses its power against its citizens. Second, it started the American Revolution. It was in 1770, and obviously the shot heard around the world was 5 years later. These things do take a while to germinate. As historian and author and my colleague, Massachusetts Judge Hilla Zobel, has declared, the trial was a propaganda battle. To sum up, the Boston Massacre was a seminal event in the lead-up to the break for independence from England. The story has many facets. The trials tell the story of conflicting evidence, the role of reasonable doubt, and whether someone could get a fair trial despite citizen hysteria. But one point is clear. By its happening, the American Revolution was coming. And now, as Paul Harvey, the radio host, used to say, and now for the rest of the story. One of the British soldiers, a fellow by the name of Pierce Butler, left the army, moved to South Carolina, and became a plantation owner. And in 1787, he became a member of the Continental Congress, which drafted the United States Constitution. And here is Attucks. And that's, you'll see that at the old granary burial ground. Yeah, my office was in that building right over the cusp of the building. And there he is. And his signature, if you look, let's see, he went to South Carolina, and here is his signature. Pierce Butler. I will tell you parenthetically that as to the other soldiers who were involved in that unfortunate evening, many of them were simply Irish lads who had been impressed by the British government into service. And after this unhappy disturbance or Boston Massacre or whatever you want to call it, they went off back to Ireland. But they were just young boys. They really were just young boys. And they probably were pretty scared, not just by the incident, but by the trial on which their lives depended later on. So that's the story of the Boston Massacre. I want to share with you, if I have, oh, here's a, I think I included this in the handout. The best book you might want to read is, well, there's two. This is pretty good, but no, Zobel's book is pretty good. And Eric Hinderaker, it came out about 4 or 5 years ago now. Let's see, yeah, 2017, time passes. And Hillary Zobel actually wrote the book. And I don't know how, one of them is called The Boston Massacre, and then Hinderaker comes along and he calls it The Boston's Massacre. And a lot of the stuff, to be honest with you, is from the earlier book that Zobel wrote in the 60s. All right? But I want to share with you a little piece of trivia if I have it. Oh, that's my grandson. Oh, you got to see my grandson, right? Of course. Yeah. I have no idea how old he was. He's 8 now. His birthday was last month. And we're going down next weekend to see him in Washington, D.C. because they're going trick-or-treating. He and his younger sister. He's the best big brother you could ever imagine. He's so kind to her, and she's a pain in the neck. Well, we love her. She's a real show person. You know, everybody has a story about their own. I want to show you something that a lot of people do not realize. And oh, by the way, the fellows, I should close the loop on this. The fellows who were found guilty of what do you call it? Manslaughter. They pled. Adams was clever. He figured this all out beforehand, at the end. They pled as their sentence the benefit of the clergy. Now, they're not members of the clergy. Obviously, they're soldiers. But that defense was, in sentencing, was allowed to them, and as a result, they did not lose their lives or spend any time in imprisonment. They were branded. They were branded on their thumbs. So T is for thievery, and M is for either murder or manslaughter. I'd take that, to be honest with you, instead of losing my life. But that's the actual branding device that they used. And see how they held their hands so that they couldn't get out of the way. Now, there's one other thing I want to show you that a lot of people have no idea is true. Where is it? Ah, here we go. The worst historical inaccuracy I've ever come across. That is not where the Boston Massacre happened. All right? I'm just telling you, it didn't happen there. Here's what happened. City of Boston had to reroute its traffic on Congress Street. It happened about close to 100 yards down the street where 60 State Street is. But they put on this pedestrian plaza here. So I used to come out from lunch from my office here, and I'd see 20, 30 kids or parents or whatever there, and I'd hear them say, and this is where, I'd say, I'm sure they hated me. No, it's not. It happened over there. They just rerouted it for us tourists, for you tourists. I wasn't really well received, but at any event, so much for historical inaccuracy. Well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
You're welcome.